Well, first of all, I appreciate your holding this hearing, and I hope it's the first of many more that we'll have discussing the nation's finances. And Director Young, I welcome you to this hearing as well, because we all know you have a very, very not only important job, but a difficult job. Some decades ago, when federal government was staring at maybe something as small as $200 billion budget deficits, there was then a Senator, Joe Biden, warned of quote unquote economic disaster unless Congress took quote unquote dramatic action on deficits right now. Senator Biden called for getting a grip on federal spending and limiting its growth with a temporary government-wide spending freeze. That's right, including COLAs. He called for reviewing the efficiency and necessity of government programs, and he pushed for changes to the budget process that would improve accountability and make it harder for presidents to pass the buck. Today, we face a far dire situation, and President Biden ought to borrow from Senator Biden's playbook. You might be interested in reading, none of you are going to do it, but May the 2nd, 1984, when this across-the-board budget freeze called the Grassley, Kassebaum, Biden-Baucus budget freeze passed the Senate by a one-vote margin. You might want to read about the hour-long speech that now President Biden and Senator Biden gave during that debate. Unfortunately, the president's budget proposal continues to take our nation down a path of fiscal and economic ruin. The White House referred to this budget as Biden's vision for the future of America. Let's talk about what that vision looks like. President Biden is proposing levels of debt, deficits, and spending previously reserved for times of world war or recession. President Biden's vision for the future is job-killing tax hikes, cradle-to-grave entitlement proposals. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the same proposal members of his own party rejected last Congress, as they called it too extreme. The president uses sleight of hand to claim he's reducing the deficit. Well, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projections, cumulative deficit between 2021 and 2031, that 10-year window, will be $6 trillion higher than what was projected when Biden took office. President Biden's new spending priorities are on track to put even more on our already maxed out credit card. President Biden's vision for the future is a continuation of his administration's assault on fiscal health of our nation during times of economic uncertainty. Annual deficits were always expected to decline from pandemic levels because we put emergency programs in place, and those emergency programs were to expire. In other words, when you put something in because we have a national catastrophe of a pandemic, and those programs wouldn't be in place if it wasn't for the pandemic, when those programs go away, then you ought to get back to the level of expenditure pre-pandemic, plus inflation, plus increase in population. But the leadership here in Congress has recklessly accelerated the return to multi-trillion-dollar deficits through legislation and even executive actions. In 2021, despite warnings from President Obama's former economic advisor, Democrats abused the budget reconciliation process to fast-track a $2 trillion liberal wish list that sparked the highest inflation that we've seen in 40 years. Democrats followed that up last year with another partisan reconciliation bill that they claimed would reduce inflation and cut the deficit, but should be to nobody's surprise and backed up by CBO figures and other independent experts found that the bill actually increases inflation. And by this administration's own estimate, the bill added another $200 billion to the nation's tab. But at least those bills actually passed Congress. The same can't be said of the administration's $400 billion or more student loan bailout or its unilateral expansion of the food stamp program. In President Biden's vision for the future, public debt dwarfs our nation's entire economic output. Annual deficits under Biden budget grow from $1.4 trillion last year to over $2 trillion 10 years from now. By 2027, public debt would surpass record levels set in the wake of World War II and continue to climb. We have a chart that shows that. Like a family or business that incurs more debt simply to make good on past debts, our nation's risk entering a vicious debt spiral as interest rates costs soar. In President Biden's vision of the future, interest on the debt costs more than the national defense. Interest costs nearly triple from $476 billion last year to over $1.3 billion at the end of the 10-year budget window, and total a staggering $10.2 trillion over 10 years, as you can see in the chart. That's $10 trillion in hard-earned tax dollars that will not go to improving the lives of Americans. With a larger share of our budget tied up in servicing our debt, we'll be less able to respond to future recessions, pandemics, and foreign threats. In President Biden's vision for the future, American debt leaves us more vulnerable and less competitive on the world stage. At home, private business investment is increasingly going to be crowded out, leading to anemic economic growth, lower wages, and fewer jobs. And you get out of this budget situation not by growing taxes, but by growing the economy. We had bank failures this past week. Those bank failures highlighted how fragile our economy is right now, given decades high inflation and rising interest rates. The more Congress borrows and spends, the higher interest rates will have to go up, and ultimately it's families and small businesses that will suffer the economic consequences. President Biden's vision for the future includes $5 trillion in tax hikes on all income levels, including millions on families with incomes under $400,000, regardless of what the president says, limiting it to just people $400,000 and above. Tax revenues are currently at historic highs, yet the president wants to extract more from families and small businesses already struggling under decades-high inflation. And remember, inflation is a tax. Right now, about 5% on everything you buy. Under his budget, the government's bite out of the economy would be the largest since World War II. And despite all that, he continues adding to our national debt at breakneck speed. Clearly, we aren't going to be able to tax our way out of the current fiscal mess. To climb out of a fiscal hole that we dug, we must stop digging. And this isn't just a Democrat problem of deficit spending. Republicans have been culpable as well. Instead, the president's proposed $2.5 trillion in new mandatory spending programs. Meanwhile, he largely ignores existing major trust fund programs that are on a path to insolvency. To the extent such programs are addressed, his budget relies on smoke and mirrors to kick the can down the road. So President Biden's vision for our future is more taxes, more debt, less opportunity, and fewer resources for essential government services. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are happy with this budget and want to embrace it as their own, then I'd say, fine, let's have a vote on it. And I'd challenge Leader Schumer to bring it to a vote and predict it'd get very few votes. And that's happened to Republican budgets as well. In other words, presidents propose, Congress disposes. Let's actually do our job and have the Budget Committee mark up a budget resolution. Let's see how show how the process is supposed to work. Republicans are ready and willing to work with presidents to get a grip on Washington's out-of-control spending and debt, but working together will require a shared acknowledgement of the serious fiscal problems we're facing and a willingness to work across the aisle. And unfortunately, I don't see any evidence that in this budget. But Senator Biden recognized that when he wanted to freeze the budget across the board, helping me do that. Thank you.